Great.
So welcome once again. It's good to have you all here. And for this second and last class about Judaism and the death penalty, there's plenty of things to talk about. So no big long introductions. I will let my dear colleagues to take it from here.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. And does everybody just give me a thumbs up? Rabbi Shana, do you see that? Okay, good. All right, so here we are back discussing Judaism and the death penalty. And as Rabbi Kulik said, there's no shortage of material to talk about. So we're going to just jump in. But we'd love if you have questions or comments along the way. I cannot see most of you, so I'm going to assume that you will not be shy and that you'll unmute and launch in with a question or a comment you have. Please do so along the way. You will not be interrupting. So let's go ahead and just dive in. We're going to begin just with a little bit of what might sound familiar review from last week, just touching on some of the concepts that Rabbi Kulik introduced, namely looking at this idea that that there's this tension within Judaism around the subject of capital punishment, specifically around, on the one hand, recognizing the severity of a crime, but also holding on the other hand this idea of the sacredness of life. So we're going to look a little bit more at the tension that exists and what our sages did to address that tension and the issue of capital punishment, knowing that it was sort of part of our legacy, but yet what do we do with that going forward? So let's just dive right in. So we looked a little bit at this text last week from Sanhedrin. Let me go ahead and change my screen here. So man was created single in the person of Adam to teach you that anyone who eliminates one person in Israel, right? So you have Adam, it's singular, not plural. Anyone who eliminates one person, the Torah considers it as though an entire world has been eliminated. And anyone that sustains one person in Israel, the Torah considers it as though an entire world has been sustained. And Adam was created singularly, not plural, to proclaim the greatness of the Holy One, meaning a person can mint many coins with one mold, and they will all be identical in appearance. And the King of Kings, Adonai, made all of mankind from the mold of Adam the first, and no one person is identical to the other. Thus, each individual person must say, "For me, the world was created." So we touched on this last week, this idea that because each human being is unique, they are also unique in their value, and they are a unique reflection of the divine. And so this text would tell you what? If you had no other text to go by in the Jewish tradition and you were trying to ascertain, what do Jews have to say about capital punishment? Where do they fall? What would this text tell you? Just jump in.
That each person is a generational entity that creates generations after generations. So maybe you don't kill someone because you're killing generations forward.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, so right. So one aspect is just that regardless of what the actions of that individual have been, that person represents not just themselves, but so many others that are yet to come. Destroying that one person destroys an entire world of individuals. So that's one aspect. What else do you take from this particular text?
That people are grateful for having a life. That's, for me, the world was created, or, that means that, we're grateful for our lives, no matter what they might be. And you don't know what each person can accomplish. So everybody has a right to life,
Nice, Linda. And this idea that, so we each must say, "For me, the world was created," is is also that the possibilities and the infinite worth for each one of us, that God doesn't favor some people over others, that each one of us is uniquely connected to the divine and has a relationship and is a reflection of, and therefore that has worth, right? So it wouldn't be
Yes.
so easy to say this life no longer has worth. Okay, good.
Right.
Anything else on this text? Any other kind of thoughts, something that jumps out at you?
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you define in this context the word eliminates?
Oh, interesting. So if I don't have the Hebrew up, and maybe Shayna or Joshua do, but my understanding is that if you were to blot out a life, literally take a life, make it no longer, that's to eliminate. In the sense of capital punishment, it would be to destroy. But in this case, it's to, so that it cannot go on further to create more lives. Is that what you're thinking as well?
Well, I guess the Torah says that you're not supposed to kill, or you're not supposed to murder.
There you go.
The word eliminates here seems to be a little broader than that. That's why I was curious.
Well,
So-
I mean, just to jump on the question from the Hebrew perspective, I'm
Thank you.
seeing here the Hebrew. The Hebrew of the Mishnah is playing with the word me'abed and ived. Me'abed is like someone who loses a nefesh, a soul. It's like a whole world is lost. That is the Hebrew word, Aleph, Bet, Dalet. The idea that when we take somebody out, a whole universe, a whole world is lost. That's the point.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, Laura?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I would say it kind of reminds me, I was reading about something called the everything theory. In other words, there's a theory where everything is connected. And so by eliminating just one individual, you're breaking an entire chain, even starting with Adonai.
Mm.
So even though we may not be consciously aware that everything is connected, I'm reading from this text that, one person is part, just connected to everyone, and you break
Part of the chain. I mean, we should certainly know that after the experience we've just now coming through, right, with a global pandemic, the interconnectedness of all of us. But yes, I mean, the notion that the rabbis had that irrespective of one's actions or character, this idea that we are all unique and of infinite worth was like a fundamental sort of idea underlying Jewish bioethics and Jewish ethics in general. So it's going to come into play. But let's go on, because we want to play a little bit with the tension that the tradition gives us. So I'm going to move us to the next slide.
Okay, this is Susan. I just have one quick question. So when you look at that previous section, we don't really know what you're here for. So every incarnation, we're here for something, and we're fixing something, or we're expanding something, or we're helping others do that. So one of the things I find unclear to me is if we deviate from what the Torah is saying, is the Torah there so that we stick to the Torah because you don't know what those other people are there for? So maybe they came here and they didn't do what they contractually said they were going to do, and the result of that is, well, guess what? You violated this portion, and so your punishment is capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
See what I'm saying? I don't have any idea what everybody else is working on. I'm kind of my full-time job. So I just kind of wondered, how does that factor into their thinking?
Well, first of all, I think you're bringing a really interesting sort of concept to a lens to this text, which is, and I'll go back to our series on what happens after we die, the afterlife in Judaism. This notion that we have multiple lives and that with each one we are here for a specific purpose. When you talk about kind of that contractual agreement, and so that just presupposes a purpose that is fine. It may be, it may not be, we don't know. But I think what you're asking is, why is Torah, or Talmud in this case, giving us this this direction? And I think part of it is that I think Torah and our legal tradition points out things to us that may seem obvious, but they clearly aren't, because we need to be reminded of them. So the idea that each person is created unique, they are the only one, we are the only ones like ourselves, right? God won't ask us why we were not like Moses. God will say, why were we not more like ourselves when we get to heaven? This idea of we're unique and we are of infinite worth, and there will be things that happen that cause us to doubt that about others. People will take actions that will cause us to pause and say, is that person of infinite worth? Are they unique, so unique that we need not destroy them, or to use the term, using the root abed, to eliminate them? So I think in this case, the Talmud is suggesting it may seem simple, but in fact, there will be many things that cause us to question that or to forget it. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you for the question. All right, so let's go on to the next text. So this text reads, it's important to know that according to halakha, even when a Beit Din, right, a rabbinic court, had the authority to apply capital punishment, only very rarely was a Torah mandated execution carried out. It was so rare that a Sanhedrin which executed one person in 7 years was labeled destructive. Although there are dozens of sins for which the Torah mandates capital punishment, in practice, the Beit Din did not kill a single person in 7 or 70 years. Thus, we see that the death penalty prescribed by the Torah, whether for Jews or non-Jews, was intended mainly as a deterrent and not to express the severity of the sin and its punishment in this world and the next. It was not meant to lead to frequent executions. So what's happening in this text? There's a lot of different things. What jumps out at you?
The deterrent, not meant to lead to frequent executions like it has in the United States.
So it's always striking, I think, to folks when we're studying Torah together, the really severe punishments that we come across. Like I think we referred to, maybe even last week, the poor gentleman, the plain Jew who's in the end of Parshat Shalach Lecha, who's found carrying wood on Shabbat, and the community determines that his life should end. He has desecrated the Sabbath. The phrase we get in Torah often for the punishment of death, whether it's idolatry or desecration of Shabbat, is mot yumat, you shall surely die. And often people will say, that seems quite severe. Why is death the punishment? And, just as the embellishment of the Passover story is there on purpose so that we remember it and we're engaged with it and intrigued by it annually, so too I think the punishment is so severe because it's meant to be a deterrent. Not you will be killed if you desecrate the Shabbat, although I would suggest that not taking time to rest and reflect is deadly for our bodies and our souls, but because it's that important, right? So in this case, it's not literally that we would be taking someone's life, but that there are, that it's meant to be a deterrent, that these are the things that are so severe you should not transgress. They're worthy of capital punishment, but it's not that the rabbis did so many things to make sure that we couldn't actually enforce that act. What else stands out?
Well, so this whole issue of deterrent is interesting because there's no way to measure deterrent. But you can't measure an action that didn't happen, and by definition, a deterrent makes that action not happen.
Unless, of course, it doesn't happen, right? So then you can count.
It happens.
It's a negative example, at that point. But I think, yeah, if someone murdered someone else and was killed for it, then you could see if the murder rate decreased, right? That's actually what they're finding in America, that it for us, it does not act as a deterrent here.
No,
right.
Murder, obviously there's many flavors of murder, but most people, I forget the statistics, but it's like 6 out of 10 murders are crimes of passion. If you're in the throes of some kind of anger or some other kind of emotional something, you're not going to click in and go, well, I shouldn't do this because of deterrent. You're just going to sort of plow ahead. And is there one size fits all for when a person takes a life, or is there gradations of that?
Well, we definitely have gradations of death, accidental deaths, unintentional homicide, and premeditation. They're very, very distinct, much like our justice system here distinguishes motivation and premeditation in their severity. So there are some caveats as well. This is not, it's not one death is equal to all deaths.
But I think the point of the deterrent in this case is that there are cultural norms and understandings that do affect societal actions and the actions of individuals within a community. So, for example, it's not a cultural norm to walk around in public naked. Thank God. So it's not that, and that becomes an accepted norm. That's not something we do. So you don't often see people violating that. So the idea that there were a number of things by which the Torah would say the punishment is of a capital offense, what we're learning is that it was not actualized, but we want to take a look at what were those actions that were clearly so important to, or safeguards for the community, that they were considered to be that severe. So let's go on from here and move in that direction. All right.
Rabbi?
Yes, Nanette.
The word, I'm sorry, I thought you were back at the other one, because the word the 7 years for me stood out, because isn't that the amount of time we're supposed to leave the earth before replanting?
Right. So 7 is an oft recurring number in Judaism. Nanette, you're right about the Jubilee year and that cycle of 7. And we can think about the 7 days in the creation cycle and the 7 steps leading to the Mayim Chaim in the mikveh, the waters of the mikveh. So 7 is a common cycle. And so whether we have 7 or 7D, which we know is also an oft referenced number, I think it's more of a symbolic notion that it never happened, right? Like in no cycle, in no period of time was this an appropriate course of action. So it's
or if it was considered extraordinarily harsh, right?
Yes. Great. But yes, to point out the 7 and 70, it stood out to me as well. All right, so we're moving on to Mishnah Makot. And here we have a Sanhedrin that executed more than one person in a week is called a murderous court. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah states more than one person in 70 years would be denoted a murderous court. And Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva state, if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, no defendant would ever have been executed. But, and here's what's often overlooked, the Mishnah gives the last word to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who responds that had they indeed ensured that the death penalty would never be carried out, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva would have been increasing the murderers in Israel. So what is happening in this text?
There is either a deterrence factor being talked about or the prevention of further murder.
What is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel saying, though?
Well, I think he's saying that if there isn't a harsh, inevitable penalty for doing an abominable act, then people won't stop doing them unless they have the fear of knowing what could be the result.
I think this, can you hear me?
Yes. Yep. Judy, we hear you.
Oh, okay, I don't know. I think what this portion says is basically what's going on today. I mean, it's very relevant to what's happening today, because there are those who say that unless you have a deterrent, then there will be more murders. And yet what we're seeing is that it really isn't a deterrent, that people, if they're going to commit murder, are going to commit murder. And the death penalty doesn't seem to be stopping them. So it's really kind of a mixed message. And this was before the sort of common research on what's going on now. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel sort of has a final word, but I think that today we're seeing that there is no final word.
Yeah, but let me interject. It's like the Mishnah never functions as the one who speaks at the end has the last word. It's just, you know, what is interesting about this text is the fact that it certainly presents the challenge and the tension. Mm-hmm. So that it's like you can go this way and that way, and you can find reasons to justify going this way or that way. The question then becomes, is the deterrent working, or it is not? It seems in the current conversation here in the United States that is clear enough that the deterrent doesn't seem to be a good reason, because it's not taking you wherever you want to be. But the fact that he speaks at the end doesn't mean that he has the last word. I would even claim that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel has, it's the minority voice,
right,
in the context of the rabbis, at least.
Right, and we'll see that, you know, they're not willing to outlaw it outright, but they will continue to put restrictions on how easily it's enacted, right? And so that's, you know, we'll get to those caveats so that you can see how difficult it is to, and it's much more difficult than you know, the standard of evidence that we have in our country in this day. Do we have that?
Yep, I can move to that text. I just want to make sure, Rick, did you want to add something before we move?
I wonder if Rabbi Akiva, his position reflected all his students being murdered by the Romans, or almost all his students being killed by the Romans.
You know, to that question, the truth is that it's not very clear that all his students were killed by the Romans. Some texts in the Talmud will claim that actually most of his students died because they hated one another, which is an interesting insight for our days as well. But it's also interesting to know that Rabbi Akiva, according to the Talmud at least, will end up executed with so many other rabbis at the time by the Romans in this case.
Yeah. Irony.
There is an element in, if we're looking to apply this here in this country, though, because you can be accused of, say, first-degree murder, but you can negotiate if you have the right attorney, right? You can end up not taking the death penalty off the table and just spend your life in prison, because the judicial system is wildly inconsistent.
And then we'll take a look at that a little bit later on if we have time, about, you know, one of the issues is how really the term is broken, how broken and unreliable and unpredictable our judicial system is here. But let's go back for just a moment before we get there and look at some of the limitations. Rabbi Mackler, if you'll take us through.
All right, so you can read along. I know, I'm sorry for the small font. There were a lot to put on a slide. When we have capital punishment, even as an option, we need to make sure that there were witnesses to the crime. And there have to be at least 2 witnesses who do not contradict each other, even in their opinion of what the color of the eyes of the perpetrator were, right? They make it so significant that they have to be, point by point, the same testimony. And the witnesses had to see each other at the time of the crime. So they had to know each other was there. And they had to be able to speak clearly, because we'll see that they have to also enforce a warning that the person was going to do a sin, before they murdered someone, say, hey, look out, you're about to commit a sin for which you can receive the death penalty, right? So there are so many restrictions that are put on, and some of them grow to be sort of, I wouldn't say comical, but a little cartoonish, outside of the realm of what might be possible. The witnesses, again, could not be related to each other or to the accused, which is an interesting caveat as well. So the warning that had the Hatorah that had to be given had to be able to be like a quick warning that the people had to be able to hear, right? So you have to make sure that it was clear as it stood out. And we also, so here, that's part of the tension, to make sure that we're going to preserve the sanctity of life. If we're going to allow the death penalty to be in existence, capital punishment, we need to make sure that we are going to do it in a way that can still, in some measure, preserve the sanctity of life. But we also have that tension that we spoke about last week and just now about weighing that against the obligation for us to be able to hold people accountable and responsible for their acts. So when someone is accused who's already committed a crime and they were given the chance for teshuvah, they repeated the crime, right? They repented, but then they repeated the crime, it would lead to a death sentence, right? Even if the witnesses were caught lying, the idea is that the people, if they had a chance to repent and did the same action again, here we have that accountability. The witnesses, this is also interesting. If the witnesses lie in those cases, if they're found out to be giving false testimony, they would be executed. Right. So the idea that when you give testimony and that you're bearing witness to something, you hold someone's life in your hand. And so to make sure that that person understands that they need to be clear and right, that as a witness, they had a lot of weight, but also they could be held responsible for that. When the Beit Din would meet, the rabbinical court would meet, they would have to examine each witness separately. So we sort of do this too when they can't hear the testimony of the others. And even if one point of their evidence was contradictory, even the eye color, the evidence was considered contradictory, and so that all of the evidence was not heeded, right? It had to be as sure as possible. We have the Beit Din needing at least 23 judges, and you couldn't have a simple majority. So we'll get to a text that's a little confusing, but what it means is that you had to at least have 13 to 11, right? You couldn't have 11 to 12, you couldn't have it back to back. It needed to be at least 13 to 11 with a split verdict. If this is one of the ones that we'll take some time with, if the Beit Din arrived at a unanimous verdict of guilty, the person was let go. The idea being that if no judge could find anything exculpatory about the accused, there was something wrong with the court. And so we're going to spend some time with this because it is almost exactly the opposite of what we have today, right? In order to have capital punishment, you would have to have a unanimous verdict. This is saying that if you come up with a unanimous verdict, the person is let go. And it's holding the court responsible for those decisions. And so in the midst of this tension, I think that we have between accountability and the sanctity of life, we also have the character of the court on trial. Right. So we want to make sure that, and I think that's what's going to bring us into our statement today, or our positions today, is how can we rely on that court to be an honest, fair, and true court. So that's one of the ones that we'll spend a minute with. Another one that was also deterrent perhaps for the witnesses was if there was going to be capital punishment, they would have to be the executioners. Right? The person who witnessed the crime would then be the one to proceed with the execution. And when the death sentence was warranted, but the court had no jurisdiction to mete out a death sentence, such as, there weren't those two witnesses, the court had the authority to lock up the convicted individual, which is, we didn't really talk about incarceration as a possibility in the Jewish world, and it becomes something that can be enacted. It's cruel here. They would put them in a cupola, like on the top of a building, isolated, confined, and they would feed him meager portions of bread and water until he died. Right. So it's a different form of a slow and terrible death, but it was not necessarily the way that we would do execution. So we will talk about some of these, but it's something, we've got, the adult men who were, they had to be known to be Torah observant, right?
Very important.
And to have legitimate professions, right? So we had a little bit of a judgment on their character as well. But I think the witness is bearing false testimony, right? Bearing false witness. One of the big 10 here, you've got that obligation rests on them as well for the purposes of upholding the character of the court, right? We want to make sure that the court is true. So we'll go, does anyone have a comment about this long list of limitations?
What's interesting, I think, is the emphasis that's put on, so you have a crime and you have a person who's being convicted of a crime, and there's so much care put on the legitimacy of the process and the court. Again, going back to our first text from Sanhedrin about the infinite value of each human life, what does it take to preserve that notion and yet still have a society that functions and can organize itself and carry out appropriate measures, but this was considered to be so gravely important that we almost have less attention paid to the convicted and more to the process and the court itself and the character of it.
Absolutely. And we spoke last week a bit about, making sure that if we were going to do this, it was done well and thoughtfully, if at all possible, preserving the sanctity of life. And so we want to make sure that if we're not going to get rid of it entirely, because there are those whose opinion is at the right time, when the hour merits it, right, that it should be able to be enacted. And for the sake of the community, which we'll see, and we'll see in the medieval times, but also in modern times. Okay, we want to move on a minute. We'll get into some of this. So here's one about the judgment. So if the court found him innocent, they dismiss him, right? If not, they move his judgment to the next day, right? So you don't have to find, by end of business, right? You don't have to, have a decision by the end of business day. They would go together pair by pair. They would decrease the amount of food they would eat. They would drink no wine all day, and they would deliberate all night. So they would sit and have these conversations, not, intoxicated. They would make sure that they were sober and focused. And then they would rise and they'd come back to court the next morning. The judge arguing to acquit would say, I argued to acquit and my opinion remains in place. And the judge arguing to convict says, I argued to convict and my opinion remains in place, right? One who has offered an argument to convict may subsequently offer an argument to acquit, but one who has offered an argument to acquit may not retract and subsequently offer an argument to convict. If they had erred, the two judicial scribes reminded them. And if they found, this is a court reporter, right? They found him innocent, they dismiss him. If not, they stand to vote. And here you have, if 12 acquit and 11 convict, then he is acquitted. right? So what, any opinion on,
Sorry.
go ahead. I thought I had someone. So if you were already in favor of acquitting, you could not take back your position and be convinced to convict.
It's almost as if, Rabbi, they're more concerned with the court making a mistake and taking the life of a potentially innocent individual than they are releasing somebody who in fact did commit a crime. So it would be more severe and more of a stain on the Jewish community if that were to happen, which is not what we see in our society today.
Right, or someone, giving in just to have it done,
Mhm.
right? Being persuaded enough to make sure that your arguments or your deliberations would not have to continue.
I think that reducing food is so interesting here. Does anybody else find that interesting, and what do you think that's about?
Well, there's a really interesting study that came out a couple of years ago in Israel, actually, about judges and their guilty verdicts and their rate of guilty verdicts in comparison to the length of time from when they last ate. So if you just had breakfast, the judge just had breakfast and you were first on the docket, you were most likely going to get, an innocent, right, not guilty verdict. If you were right before lunch, you were not so lucky, right? They found that there were trends with the hungrier, which is interesting here, the hungrier the judge was, the more likely they were to convict, which is a really interesting study that they did, and how it plays into here. They would decrease the amount of food, but I think that's for sleepiness more than anything else.
But I think that, Dan Ariely, who is a behavioral economist from Israel, but working here, he writes about that in one of his books. And he also mentions, you don't want to be the first one after they ate lunch because they are sleepy, which
this is it.
Which comes exactly to what the Mishnah is saying. So it's very interesting that it comes here and in today's research.
What we see is that it pays attention to the fallibility of human beings and the fact that human beings are entrusted with this decision for life and death, which is, in every other place in our text really should be God's, God's purview. And so to understand that we are influenced in different ways by food, by drink, by persuasion, by exhaustion, we have to make sure that people are in their best form when they're doing this. And so I think paying attention to, the human error and the human fallibility really speaks to why that integrity of the court was so important. And why these restrictions were placed on. If we were going to allow the possibility of it, we had to absolutely restrict how the humans can mess it up. Linda?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting because when they're reducing the food, they are seeing themselves very much like the person who's on trial, because it's getting down to more to the human issue, because they eat and that person eats, they drink, that other person drinks. If that person doesn't, they don't. But the other thing is that I noticed is that the words are really kind of going more towards the person who's been convicted. The judge who found him innocent more than the judge who found him guilty, because the innocent can't change the judge who's found him innocent can't change his mind, but the judge who found him guilty can change his mind. Right. So I think that they're kind of pushing towards that. I don't know.
It seems that is what they're doing, right? So and we'll see that again and again, that there is a desire, it seems, to land on the side of innocence, or at least not guilty in this case, right? So to not convict. It looks like there is a, that shift, that weightedness toward that end, because I think they realize that, you can't unring the bell. And I think they're trying to make sure that if someone finds that redeeming thing, that makes them innocent, let's hang on to that before we do something we can't take back, right? All right, so we want to move on for, here we have the same thing, like we need to make sure the balance is correct. So here we have, if 22 acquit or convict and one says, I don't know, then you have to add more judges, right? You don't sit there and re-deliberate, you just bring in more opinions on the matter. And so you have the same thing that's going on. If you add the 2 judges 2 by 2, we like that idea. So here you have Noah's Ark of a court, and you bring in until there's that odd number of 71. If 36 acquit and 35 convict, he is acquitted. Again, it's the same thing. It ends, if there's that tip of the balance that way. But if 36 convict and 35 acquit, they argue against one another until the ones that have voted to convict are convinced the other way. Right? So you will see like this constant erring to the side of acquitting. Does that work?
How long does all this take? I mean,
at least overnight. I don't know how long necessarily. Maybe Rabbi Kulik or Rabbi Rice knows about the tenure of deliberation, the length of deliberations, but at least overnight. They would not necessarily do this in one day, but you're going to add two by two. You're going to get. It seems to be a longer journey, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right, moving on.
I'm not suggesting expediency, but there is an underlying thought through all this that, I mean, maybe it's just I have a minor in criminology, and so it's hard for me to separate that at the moment. But
yeah, you'll see, in some ways it is it aligns well with the American judicial system, and in other ways it is absolutely distinct. And so we know, especially, when, we say in America, they're innocent until proven guilty, but it's really sort of enacted here that you have this, the desire really, I don't think we treat people in America that way. I think if they're, convicted, or if they're, held up or taken to court for a crime, we tend to view them, I think, as a culture, as already guilty.
Mm-hmm.
But this is really warning against that, again, for the human perception, and our just realizing where we are and where our passions are. I'm gonna go ahead.
Rabbi, I don't think as well, Susan, that it's necessarily a literal prescription when you're asking about how long something it takes, but in fact, that it is so detailed in an effort to make it so difficult to convict and mete out the punishment of capital punishment is I think what we're meant to glean from these texts. If that makes sense?
Right. We don't know that these cases would go on, and then you'd have 2 jurists coming in 2 by 2.
Right.
Exactly. Right. We don't know exactly. I'm going to suggest maybe we talked a little bit about this. The idea that damim, right, that your brother's blood is in the plural, talking about his blood and his progeny's blood. So if we could maybe
yeah, we did
this. Thanks.
But if you send a person for life imprisonment, that's circumventing the actual what we can call capital punishment, and that individual is highly likely to be murdered in prison, because we're trying to not send them to the beach to holiday. These are really horrendous settings,
right?
House humans in under the guise of punishment. So how who's then accountable for the blood of that person who's serving life in prison and dies in the prison?
Well, you're asking an important but difficult question, and one that I think really strains ethicists and ethical individuals here in our country, because these are some of the issues that we deal with the whole system of incarceration and justice and how it's meted out. It's just one difficult aspect of it that you raise. So you're right. It's not just how do we safeguard the infinite worth of one life in the courtroom. It's well, so we don't deliver a crime of capital, a punishment that is as extreme as a death penalty, but at what point have we totally relinquished responsibility for that life by the way it then, goes from there? And it's an important question, but we're going to go back to kind of our Jewish text to look at how else our tradition manages this tension.
So we'll see, here's that peculiarity with the paradox with this anti-unanimity stance, which I think is really, it speaks again to the integrity of the court. So there's a case that was brought up in Sanhedrin, in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, and Rav Kahana said, if the Sanhedrin, if the Jewish court unanimously find the accused guilty, he is acquitted, right? That's what we saw in the list of guardrails. And they ask why. And one answer that's given is because we have learned by tradition that sentence must be postponed till the morrow in hope of finding new points in favor of the defense. I'm going to stop it there because it refers back to the other case. So the idea is that if it is unanimously decided that the accused is guilty, he is acquitted. And this first reason that's given is that we need to postpone, our deliberation in hopes of finding new points in favor of the defense. What does this mean?
It means there's some good in everybody. You can find some good in everybody. You just have to really be aware and conscious of looking for it.
You're right on the path, I think, of what the jurists were supposed to be doing, right? If we can scoot to the next slide, we can see someone else. Oh, is that you? Sorry. We can see that there was a choice that was being made for vigorous defense, for zealous defense of the defendant. And the jurists that were brought in were supposed to be able to argue almost impossible sides, right? They were supposed to be able to bring up everything that they could possibly bring up. And if that didn't happen, if there was, a unanimous decision that this accused was really was fully guilty, then the court was not doing its job. And they held the court responsible for that, not the accused.
Yeah.
And so it was too easy, too good to be true. And they really took it seriously when they didn't want to go into groupthink, as it were. So the Aramaic word that's used in the passage is potrin, which is understood usually to mean exonerated. So acquitted or exonerated. But there's one rabbi that's mentioned. He's a medieval scholar, the Ramah. He says that the potrin, that exonerated, is actually meaning he's sent away, meaning killed, right? He's sent away is his euphemism for being killed immediately. So he has a very different take, but that's the minority opinion. But I wanted you to see that it's there, that there are people that read it differently. There are rabbis that read it differently and scholars, but most of them say that potrin would mean exonerated, not just sent away, like, euphemistically sent away, never to be seen again.
This is Kathy Rosenblum, and I was wondering if I could say something.
Yes.
Well, my sister-in-law, Benita Kamowitz, is there too, and she sent me an article from the New York Times recently, it very recently written, and it was about how current research shows that best decisions are made when there are dissenting views.
Yep.
So, in terms of what you were saying before about not making a decision until the next day if there's a unanimous vote, because they want to hear dissenting views, because then they can look at more angles, look at the situation from different perspectives. And even current research says that that's the best way to make decisions.
Absolutely. And that's when we promote diversity of thought, right? I think that's
Yes.
the whole purpose of why we do what we do, Kathy, with the Talmud, right? We want to engage in that debate because it can help us come to the best decision possible. If we, they didn't have their filter bubbles or their echo chambers or whatever the words are that we want to use today, where you're only surrounding yourselves with people who think the way you do and who agree with you all the time, you don't get the benefit of growing and of coming to the best decision. So we want those dissenting opinions because I really do feel like we need them to come up with the best the best possible solution, right? Or the best answer.
Right.
So I think so. Here we have two different, one from the 16th century, one from the 19th century. So when a Sanhedrin unanimously convicts a defendant, collusion must be suspected. Right? Collusion. They're talking about the integrity of the court and the jurists. Since a verdict is reached without any dissenting opinion, the judges on the Sanhedrin are not doing their job properly, and they are not making the impossible arguments. As such, the Sanhedrin's unanimity is suspect, and the verdict is dismissed. So the impossible arguments they're talking about is, this comes in a conversation about how jurists are supposed to be incredibly bright and thoughtful and able to be to engage in these impossible arguments. And the example that's given is to be able to argue that an entirely impure animal is pure. Right? It's impossible, right? But you need a jurist who can come up with a way to do that. So this is the vigorous defense the zealous defense that we hope for our defense attorneys today, that they find every possible way of coming, in good faith, coming up with their defense, because only when that happens can our system work, right? And so here you say, if it's just unanimous, then they're not working hard enough. They're suspect. There's something else going on. In the 16th century, Judah Lowe said, the function of the Sanhedrin is to look for evidence of innocence rather than guilt. It totally flipped what we see today. In other words, they should not be so concerned about punishing those who have committed a wrong. The court should stick to its business of finding merit in the defendant's fault.
Marathon in half. This tutorial will get you
Sorry.
ready for your race.
Okay.
I don't know why I said that. Sorry.
But we have, are there any opinions about that? What the court is supposed to be doing, searching for innocence rather than looking for guilt.
Where in all this is the victim?
That's a really good point.
Yes, I want to know because I have a personal experience. When I was a little girl, my uncle was murdered. He and my aunt owned a little candy store with a soda fountain. And it was in the Bronx, and two people came in. They murdered my uncle and they tied up my great aunt. And they never found the people who perpetrated the crime. And so having a family member murdered, I understand and I empathize with all this, but I wanted to know what the rabbis did think of these, the people who were, involved.
I think that, go ahead.
Well, I just think it's so interesting to bring it up, Nanette, and it's really a conversation all into itself, because certainly here in the United States, there is a real deficit in addressing the victim, those who are involved in the restorative justice movement see that as a major miss, that we've really just not. Once a crime's committed, the victim is not even sort of like considered part of the equation in many ways, and that really doesn't even allow for what we would in Judaism consider a teshuvah process, right? Absolutely has to engage with the victim and the one who's been wronged. And yet, given that is such an important emphasis in our tradition, it's interesting to not see that come in more as a factor here. And I think it is not, I don't want to be dismissive. It's not that it's not as important, but it's an and, meaning this must be an important conversation and there must be that piece too. So I don't think that because there's so much emphasis right now put on ensuring the integrity of the court, that it means that the victim and their experience doesn't matter. But even in Torah itself, when we look at like cities of refuge, for example, somebody who's committed a crime and while, during the time that it's being investigated so that they can be protected, they're put in the city of refuge. We have very little to no language around the experience of the victim in that case. It's really always about the perpetrator and then the process.
Well, and I think it doesn't give solace to families who are victims of crimes, and your God forbid situation, of course, if it was a wrongly convicted person,
Sure.
right? So that,
Totally agree.
right,
Yeah,
so
I totally agree. It was just interesting to see if there was anything, that they did bring. But I hear what you're saying, Rabbi Roy. This right now we're focused on the, taking a life, not, retribution. So
But it's
right,
interesting that you bring it up, because I know Rabbi Mackler would have experienced this as well when we were part of the Leadership Nashville experience, and we heard from a panel of victims of, of violent crime and what they've come to understand and know. I mean, similar to the experience that you shared very vulnerably, and thank you for sharing that, Nanette. That this notion that they are not attended to or consoled even. I mean, healing the victim is not part of our institutionalized process.
right. And it is what, for Rambam, for Maimonides, he actually, that is his biggest argument about the capital punishment. It just doesn't allow for that teshuvah, right? It doesn't allow for that healing to take place. And if we really, really fully believe, right here we have, why are we going to have the punishment anyway? Are we going to just do it because it's retributive justice? Are we doing it because it is a utilitarian approach, right? That we want to make sure that everyone stays safe. And this is it's going to give the theory was it was going to give victims. Oh, can you go back to one?
I can, but Rabbi, I just want to remind you that it's 12:57. So I didn't know if you wanted to jump ahead, because we were going to, just so you know, Rabbi Shane and I have like 3 hours of material for you, and we're going to get to about a third of it. So
but I did want to just point out that the utilitarian approach and the retributive justice, like that was the idea of retributive justice was supposed to be for the benefit of the aggrieved party. Right. And I think they recognize that it wasn't always happening that way. And so we add that layer of teshuvah onto even the utilitarian approach so that we would try to make it a deterrent for the betterment of society and allow for that healing process to happen. So we definitely do have way more, many more slides, but Rabbi Rice, do you want to go through at least quickly sort of the movement's positions in our modern time?
So we don't mean to slight Maimonides, but we're going to move past. All right. So I mentioned about the broken justice system, and while Rabbi Warschauer is not the entire conservative movement, as Rabbi Kulik will attest, I just thought his statement was important to note, this notion that the capital punishment system is broken, and because of that, we can't even call it a justice system. There's too much at stake and too much that's not reliable in order to be playing with lives and whether they live or die. So I'm going to move past. Reform movement has formally opposed the death penalty since 1959 in light of modern scientific knowledge, concepts of humanity. It's not, the idea of capital punishment is no longer morally justifiable. It's a stain upon civilization and our religious conscience.
But this goes to the integrity of the court. If they're willing to take science-based evidence in, if they're willing to continue to hear those arguments, that speaks directly, I think, to the integrity of the court.
Yep. Okay, we're going to move past that. We have the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America in 2000 supported a resolution that imposed a nationwide moratorium on executions of death row inmates, pending a comprehensive review of how the death penalty is applied and administered in the United States. Moshe Feinstein, who is one of the preeminent scholars of responsa, wrote a teshuvah, a legal ruling to the governor of New York State opposing executions except in dire circumstances. Those weren't specified, calling upon this particular text. And we have from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, the paragraph below, in practice, these punishments were almost never invoked and existed mainly as a deterrent, which we've seen today. And as also we mentioned, to indicate the seriousness of the sins for which they were prescribed. The rules of evidence and other safeguards that the Torah provides to protect the accused made it all but impossible to actually invoke these penalties. The system of judicial punishments could become brutal and barbaric unless administered in an atmosphere of the highest morality and piety. When these standards declined among the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin voluntarily abolished the system of penalties. And what I'd like to say here is sometimes we ask, well, if it is an abhorrent system and outdated and repugnant and seemingly antithetical to everything we hold to be true and valuable with regards to understanding the sanctity of human life, why wouldn't we just sort of cross that out? Just erase that from our Torah, just erase that from our tradition. And I think Judaism does something really unique and special, which is that it preserves and maintains even what we see now to be what we might consider to be offensive or outdated or a stain on our past or our history. One, because it's important to know from whence we've come, right? Who were we? Who were our ancestors? What was important to them? How did they engage communally? And also as a learning opportunity of here's who we are not today. Here's how we do no longer function because we want to grow and become a more sophisticated and empathetic and caring and loving society. So, and so as such, there are responsa, modern legal rulings that give us loopholes that allow us to kind of go around what once was, that we want to say, well, it doesn't apply now because we know more about medicine. And organ donation is another example of, okay, this was once how we carried on, but now we have more information, and so this is what we do now. And I just wanted to make sure to emphasize that.
But it is something that you can find, and also with organ donation in many ways, there are similarities across our movements. And I think that speaks volumes to that tension, but also to the recognition that we want to be able to preserve life. And we want to be able to have accountability. I do want to make sure that that comes across, is that I think these are places where our movements can stand together, for those values that we do hold dear.
I'd like to, if it's okay, rabbis, just end with a story because I think it's really powerful. Eichmann, which I feel like Rabbi Kolek referenced last week, was the second person to ever be executed in the state of Israel, which in 1954 abolished the death penalty for murder, except in cases of war crimes against the Jewish people and treason during wartime. The first person to be executed was Meir Tobiansky, an officer in the IDF, who was falsely accused of passing information to the enemy during the War of Independence. He was court-martialed and executed by firing squad on June 30th of 1948. A year later, David Ben-Gurion publicly exonerated him, who was reburied with full military honors on Mount Herzl, and inscribed on his gravestone are the words, "Killed by mistake." So, in an age where we'd rather not be reminded of our misgivings and our errors, Israel has made it quite clear, engraved in stone, what it chooses and does not want to ever forget, which is capital punishment is not to be taken lightly. And in fact, there are grave consequences for extinguishing one life.
Thank you so much for joining us for these conversations, historic and timely, relevant to what we're facing today. So we appreciate your study. Thank you, Rabbi Kolek, for inviting us to teach with you, to join you. And I love having our community together.
Thank you, everyone. We'll do more of this. In the meantime, keep studying, keep learning. It's and fighting the good fight for all that is important.
Thank you.
Okay, never a dull moment.
Thank you very much.
Rabbis.